And in return, what do you want from me?
2,000 soldiers.
And what else?
500 knights on horse.
And what else?
Arms and siege equipment.
And what else?
I never wrote because I thought you'd never answer. You got married.
Does that make a difference?
Doesn't it?
I've spent 2 years on every street in hell.
That's odd, I never saw you there. You haven't said you loved me.
When the time comes.
Welcome to the Greenwood. I'm your host, Thaddeus Papke, and this is the podcast where we peek under the hood of the most famous outlaw who may have never been. From archers to archaeologists, we interview subject matter experts and content creators to learn why this figure continues to endure, and consider what we can learn by examining what historian Maurice Keene called the matter of the Greenwood. Before the theme music, I played a brief exchange from the 1968 film The Lion in Winter, between the future King Richard I and King Philip of France, as played by Anthony Hopkins and Timothy Dalton. While the film raises questions regarding whether or not the two were in love, or if Philip was just playing politics, it is unambiguous in presenting the two of having had a physical relationship. Is there a historical basis for that presentation? I'll read a passage written by contemporary chronicler Roger Howden that likely inspired James Golden in his writing of that portion of The Lion in Winter. This account comes from the summer of 1187, which is when Richard was basically at war with his father, Henry II of England. After peace was made, Richard, Count of Poitou, remained with the King of France against the will of his father, that being Richard's father. And the King of France held him in such high esteem that every day they ate at the same table and from the same dish, and at night the bed did not separate them. On account of this vehement love that seemed to have arisen between them, the King of England was greatly stupefied and wondered what it could mean, and taking precautions for the future, frequently sent messengers into France for the purpose of recalling his son Richard. Through our modern perspective, that seems like a pretty unambiguous description of two men in a sexual and romantic relationship with one another, although it is still secondhand. But as historian Hilary Rhodes, who wrote that translation of Roger Howden's account, makes clear, we need to reframe that passage in a medieval mindset. However, Hilary also lays out a case for there being other evidence that makes a stronger case for Richard's queerness. Of course, what lies at the heart of this discussion is not the private life and preferences of a man who passed away over 800 years ago, but how we interface with the man's legacy and the centuries of homophobia that has led previous historians, politicians, and writers to get invested in Richard's sexuality and let it influence how he and his brother John have been depicted in both literature and history books. There's a lot to unpack here, and fortunately, Hilary Rhodes was able to join me in discussing it. So, string your bow, maybe check a few assumptions, and join me in the Greenwood with historian Hilary Rhodes.
Hello.
Hello, good morning.
Yes. Good morning to you, although afternoon for me.
Yes, morning over here, afternoon over there, I think.
Yes. How are you doing?
Pretty good, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. I just kind of stumbled upon your paper, and just to make sure I get the name right of the paper, it is Richard the Lionheart, Contested Queerness and Crusading Memory.
Yes, that's my paper.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk to you about that paper and talk in general about queerness in the Middle Ages. But let's start with just who you are and how you came to that topic.
All right, well, my name is Dr. Hilary Rhodes. I finished my PhD at the University of Leeds Institute for Medieval Studies in 2019. This was a topic that I developed sort of in parallel to my PhD thesis. My PhD thesis was actually about Burgundy and the Crusades, which is a separate region of France, but there was a lot of reference to, especially in chapter 5 of that, the Third Crusade, where Hugh of Burgundy was working with Richard on crusade, and Richard was a figure that I had already been interested in, and this was sort of granted a passing mention in one of my dissertation chapters, but it's a paper that I developed originally for the International Medieval Congress at Leeds, and which I had given there, and then which eventually turned into that paper about 2.5-ish years ago, when one of my colleagues was putting together an edited collection on the Angevins and had basically asked if I had anything to contribute. And I said, well, yes, I do have this paper. So it had been then redeveloped and submitted as part of that collection. So that's how basically the quick history of that piece.
And just to provide a little bit of background for the listeners, so King Richard I, one of the figures that kind of looms large in the popular consciousness, in large part due to his connections to the Robin Hood stories, although that's mostly through Ivanhoe and popular films. So it's really just kind of about the last 200 years of Robin Hood stories. King Richard's really been this very heroic figure and then portrayed on screen in these big heroic sort of ways. You get Sean Connery coming in as King Richard at the end of Prince of Thieves. So he's this figure that people have an association with, and he's often portrayed as the Crusader king, the powerful warrior king. And there's been this contested concept of queerness that has been associated with him really since his lifetime, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just kind of want to say up front that while a lot of people throughout the centuries have brought their own prejudices to the notion, and there have been a lot of people that want to try to promote, the Richard as the warrior, and they want him to be the manly man, and this relates to the statue that's up before the House of Parliament of Richard. And so therefore, a lot of people throughout time have kind of not wanted him to be gay because it doesn't fit with their stereotypical idea of somebody being a manly warrior.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think it's worth pushing back against that idea that that those are contradictory ideas.
Yes, absolutely.
So what brought you to Richard?
I began as an undergraduate studying medieval history when I was quite a few years ago now. So when I was studying medieval history, I had started studying the Norman Conquest in Oxford as an undergraduate, and sort of moving from there, Richard was kind of the next step down the line. I had studied William the Conqueror, I had studied the early Norman Conquest England, moving into the early Plantagenets, and then to Richard himself, who I found to be a very interesting figure, in part because I picked up on that tension with his queerness and his conflict as a warrior very quickly. Like I would say probably 14, 15 years ago, when I first started writing and looking into Richard, I had already picked up that tension in terms of his queerness versus his historical legacy versus the contested legacy of the Crusades, especially post 9/11, which is something that I touch on a little bit in that piece in terms of post 9/11, the Crusades are good but bad, but good but bad, and it's kind of going back and forth in terms of, especially as we now have a more awareness of a queer history, but we're also getting more uncomfortable with what the Crusades promoted in other ways. So in some sense, there's more ability to, recover a queer ancestor in terms of Richard, but he's still involved with the Crusades, and that's something which becomes equally complex and problematic in terms of how do we think about him? What does his sexuality mean in terms of this figure who is very much part of this crusading enterprise? How do we understand that conflict now, in the post 9/11 world?
Yeah, and I want us to get back more into some of the specifics about Richard and also to John as well and other members of their family. But to kind of establish some kind of baselines, could you tell us a little bit about how people from around that time, so we're talking around the late 12th century, so late 1100s or so, how did people, both the church, noble people, peasants, how was homosexuality viewed during that time?
That is kind of a complex question, obviously. We have, in the early 11th century, we have some penitentials, which are handbooks for priests, where they're basically kind of breezing right on past the idea. They're like, well, there's this sin with, possibly homosexual in nature, as far as we can read it. It's like, oh, well, pass on some certain amount of bread and water, move on past it. So it exists, but it's not really considered, a huge social defining threat. And especially in the 12th century, we have a lot of tension around potential queerness with knights, because what we have is the very, very intense, very self-sacrificial bond of chivalry between warriors who are supposed to love each other more than anything and to do everything for each other. It's this very valorized, knightly bond. But there's also this very definite anxiety, like, well, if you tell them to love each other past, all reason, then maybe they're having sex on the side. There's this anxiety about whether this homosocialness of the knights becomes homosexual, and there becomes increasingly more clerical polemic around it in terms of, there's this piece by, I think it's Matthew Queffler, who is talking about this 12th century anxieties around possible sodomy. So that's when you see it becoming more clarified in terms of a potential social threat. You also have a number of churchmen writing at this time who are starting to treat sodomy as, very dangerous.
Yeah,
So
you mentioned Peter the Chanter.
Peter the Chanter, is the example that I use in my paper, who is now redefining sodomy in the late 12th century as this, horrible sin comparable only with murder. But at the same time, he's writing that because in Paris, which is where Peter the Chanter is based, we have more evidence, not what we would necessarily call a queer subculture, but something like that. Like, he's talking about real people. He's talking about real behavior. He's not just making up a social concern out of thin air, although sometimes, churchmen will use it rhetorically and will use it as a way to condemn the church or to condemn other people that they're talking about, but they're talking about real people in this case. So by the fact that it's being more condemned, we can sense that it's more visible, especially in 12th century Paris, and especially in this context where Richard is growing up, as a warrior in 12th century France and England. He's very much exposed to this culture of love between knights, between men. Is it chaste or is it carnal? Basically, is the concern for churchmen. But as ever, when talking about queer history, I think it's important to note that just because the churchmen are writing about it negatively does not necessarily mean the larger society is, you, a gay person, whenever they see them.
Yeah.
There is a tension between the lived experience and what, conservative legal churchmen are writing about that experience, the same as there is today. So, like, we have the sense that the medieval era is necessarily worse for everybody, and, there's so much oppression happening, but that's not necessarily the case, at least from what we can always recover from sources. Like, just because the church is saying, the church says today that being gay is bad, that doesn't mean people are still living that way.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering a couple of things. One, even though the church is starting to come out more and more against being gay around this time, and the church was incredibly powerful during this time of history, how much this was translating into legal code. Like, were people being arrested? Were people being charged with sodomy as a crime?
I would say less at this point. That the sodomy trials are usually from the 16th century, and later on, like, there are a few scattered occasions that I can think of, where
So more
like,
post-Reformation.
So yeah, more post-Reformation is when we get witch trials, we get sodomy trials, we get a lot more of that stuff that people they sort of habitually call medieval, but which is really more early modern in nature.
And I was also kind of wondering about class differentials. There's so much concern with members of the gentry in relation to their marriages being made for political alliances, about the need for having heirs. So you could sort of see this social issue that might arise from homosexual activity, where it's like, well, we don't really care what your hobbies are, but you still need to produce your heirs. And if that is a real kind of way of framing that situation, and also if poorer classes might have a little bit more leeway because there'd be less pressure for producing heirs.
Well, of course, the difficulty is we can only talk about the sources that we have. So when there's somebody who might have had perfectly, out, so to speak, life in the lower classes, we may not necessarily even know about that person, because especially in pre-modern sources, when we're looking for queerness, it often comes in contact with the legal system or is shaped by some way, by laws, by religion, by somebody objecting to it in some way. So in a sense, we don't know the rest of the experience. So there's just a lot we can't say, because we don't have source material to really draw that conjecture in a sustained fashion. So certainly in Richard's case, it was an issue because he didn't have an heir. And if maybe if he had a son, he wouldn't have been badgered about it by the church as often as he was. So I feel like there was definitely some sort of dynastic component in terms of, as I discussed in my paper, he is repeatedly chastised by the church for queer behavior. And right. I think a lot of that anxiety is connected to the fact that he does not have a son. So he doesn't have, he might have one bastard son, but they're not legitimate, they're not in line to inherit the throne. Eventually John takes over. So I think that certainly because Richard is a king and because he's expected to have an heir, there is a certain extra level of anxiety about his queerness. Maybe there's knights doing it on the side. The church is upset about that. Maybe people at large aren't, but Richard cannot be excused in that fashion because his central dynastic obligation is to engage in married heterosexual intercourse long enough to have a son, and he fails in that duty. So that is a serious issue just in terms of politics and succession. It becomes more than just his personal preference in that case. What are you not doing? Why aren't you having a son?
Right. So, and then that provides, a kind of avenue for people to attack him or criticize him, but the lack of the legitimate heir helps provide some legitimacy or perhaps motivation for some of these complaints, or also even just trying to politically undermine him, because he does have political enemies in Europe. One of the big ones being Philip.
Yes.
And let's go ahead and get into the dynamic between Richard and Philip. I brought this up on an episode of the podcast recently. We were reviewing the 1975 miniseries, The Legend of Robin Hood. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
I don't think that, but there are a lot of them. So
yeah, there sure are. And that's a very interesting one, especially coming out a few years after Lion and Winter, which you do reference in your paper, of course. And Lion and Winter definitely shows a homosexual relationship between Richard and Philip II of France. And we know that they were very close at one point, and we know that they became bitter enemies later in life. And I brought up that dynamic because in the miniseries, the Robin Hood one from 75, there's a similar dynamic between Robin Hood and King Richard. They become very close very quickly, and then they have a sort of falling out, and Richard sort of treats Robin like a jilted lover for the rest of the show. And it reminded me of that relationship between Richard and Philip. So one of the things that comes up the most, and I've definitely, you mentioned it right at the beginning of your article, it's the first thing that will kind of come up in just sort of medieval blog posts about Richard's queerness, is the account from Richard of Howden from when was it? 1187?
1187, yeah.
About how close the relationship between Richard and Philip II was. And so this would have been, just for context, 1187. This is just like 2 years before Richard's father Henry dies. There's a lot of conflict between Richard and his father. And so there's a useful political alliance that Richard has developed with Philip, right?
Yes.
And in this kind of paragraph that the chronicler Richard of Howden writes, he talks about Philip and Richard being very close. He talks about their relationship shocking Henry, and he mentions them sharing a bed. And so this is like the thing that immediately gets leapt on, is like, oh, these men were sharing a bed. It says so right there. They must be gay. You point out in your article that that's actually worse evidence for Richard's homosexuality than later things like the rebukes that he gets from the church.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about that account from Richard of Howden, how we may or may not want to interpret that, and then why those later rebukes from the church actually do provide stronger evidence of Richard's queerness?
Yeah, I think what happens when we're looking at that paragraph from Roger of Howden is that people read it in this way to say, oh, they're sharing a bed, they must be gay, where that is not really strong evidence in terms of the pre-modern context, because
the very modern lens.
Bed sharing is not necessarily a sexual act in the medieval world. For example, I think Edward IV, who is known as a big womanizer in the 15th century during the Wars of the Roses, he habitually shares his bed with male courtiers to show, they're in the king's favor, they're, physically close to the king. That is not necessarily indicative of a sexual relationship. As we know, Edward IV, had a lot of sex with women and did so repeatedly. So it does not necessarily mean that he is gay because he is sharing his bed with male courtiers. And because we have different concepts of personal space, different concepts of, access to the king and what the king's body means, it does not necessarily mean that there is a sexual relationship happening, even if the courtier, or in this case, the visiting Prince Richard, is sleeping physically in bed with the king. So that is, their dialogue, a whole other reference of behavior, which is included there, which was not necessarily sexual in nature, although in Richard and Philip's case, it is hinted in terms of the vocabulary that the chroniclers use and the allusions that they make that they think this affair was sexual. So in this case, maybe it was, they are sleeping together in multiple senses of the word. They are sharing a bed and they are having sex, but being in the bed alone is not proof in the way that modern people often read it. So when we're looking at, are we going to definitively say that Richard was queer? It is more compelling to look at the later clerical rebukes. There's like three that I can think of, in 1191 before the Crusade, and 1195 after he gets back to England, and 1198 when he's once more in Normandy, most of the time playing Philip. So
and these are specifically for sexual misdeeds.
Yes. these are specifically for sexual misdeeds, and as I discussed in the article, these do not exist for other people in Richard's family, for his ancestors, for his father, they were not short on sexual misbehavior in the Angevin era. But Richard is the only one who is getting these specific rebukes repeatedly with a certain set of vocabulary. Like in 1195, they literally say, the sin of Sodom will, you will pay if you continue engaging in it. And then he is sick and he takes his wife back briefly. So there is a lot of, medieval Latin has very different, sometimes sexual terms. Sometimes they avoid speaking about sodomy, but the fact that they avoid speaking about it means exactly what's being suggested. It's not an incoherent omission. They say, oh, the sin I can't mention, everyone knows what that sin is. Mm-hmm. So it is a consistent pattern of behavior in terms of the words. And as I said, the church is concerned that Richard is failing in his chief duty as a king, which is to have a legitimate son. It is their business if he is engaging in homosexual intercourse and not having children, because he's the king. He is the head of state. His childlessness has direct political implications for the kingdom, for the church.
Right.
So it's, you can read it as just being medieval clerics being busybodies, which sometimes they are, of course, but they do have a legitimate political reason to intervene in this case and to say specifically what's going on.
And Richard's lack of an heir really does kind of create this potential for a very serious political power struggle.
Yes.
He doesn't have a clear heir. He's got a younger brother in the form of John, but he also has a nephew in the form of Arthur, the son of Geoffrey, who was dead by that point. So who of those has the better claim, the nephew or the younger brother? Like, clearly, if he had a legitimate son, that son would have the rightful claim. Yeah. So there's already this potential for problems, potential for civil war. And it hadn't been that long ago when there had been basically another power struggle.
Yeah, the anarchy was the mid-12th century civil war where Henry, Richard's father, became king at the end of that. So there had been, a decades-long civil war because Empress Matilda was a woman. She was the only surviving legitimate child of her father. And then her cousin decided because he was a man, he had a better claim. And there had been a decades-long civil war already, which had been very damaging for England in terms of who had the proper right to the crown. And and Arthur was still alive when Richard died in 1199. So that question was not resolved. Yeah. There was a dynastic struggle, immediately after Richard's death between John and Arthur, and because there was not, again, a clear heir to the throne.
Yeah. And that struggle, I think, often gets overlooked. Arthur often gets kind of forgotten in history, or at least forgotten in popular culture reinterpretations of history. So what do we know about Richard and his relationship with his wife?
We do not know much, just because it was often distant and they don't really seem to have been close. It was a political match. Her name was Berengaria. She was from Navarre, which is one of the constituent kingdoms of pre-1492 Spain. And she was a political match because Richard was close with her brother, Sancho, and they had worked together because Richard was the Duke of Aquitaine in the south of France, and that was already an existing regional connection that he had. And he did not want to marry Alice of France, who was Philip's half-sister, due to various other ongoing issues between them. So he had caused a bit of a scandal by breaking his engagement with Alice and marrying Berengaria instead. He did bring her to the Holy Land while he was on crusade, which is one of the more frustrating lapses, because she was one of several, actually, royal women in the Holy Land on crusade, but we don't know anything about time there. She was there with Richard's sister Joanna. He had gone to Sicily. Joanna had been widowed. There had been a big struggle there, and he brought both his sister Joanna and his wife Berengaria to the Holy Land on crusade with him. But because our chroniclers follow almost exclusively the male military action, we don't know what they were doing there. We have occasionally a reference to them. He sends people to bring them to different fortresses. Eventually there's a whole episode in Cyprus when their ship goes astray in a storm, and he goes to Cyprus to rescue them, and that delays his entrance to Jerusalem. So they are tangible in terms of their impact, but we just do not know, if the relationship was warm at the start, or if he made, an effort to have a wife, or we just do not know. We know that by the time he left Crusade and he was captured on the way home, and there was his mother, Eleanor, was very involved in securing his release. He comes back to England very briefly, then he goes back to France for most of his reign to fight Philip. And we know by this point they're estranged because he says, the chronicler says in 1195 that Richard has not known Berengaria for a long time. Like, they have not been living together. They have not been, living as man and wife. And then briefly, Richard makes an effort to kind of atone for that, takes Berengaria back, lives with her publicly for a while, but by 1198, 3 years later, they're estranged again. So it's not really, there's not much of an actual long-term relationship there. And obviously they don't have a son, so we don't know why that was.
Right. And I've seen that distanceness that existed between them and the periods of estrangement and the lack of an heir as evidence for Richard's at least homosexual preferences, but that's also a little bit of like, well, the lack of evidence isn't evidence.
Yeah. So
it's two individuals. They could not get along. Who are married for political reasons,
Yeah, maybe, we don't know why. And sometimes it's suggested that Richard didn't consummate the marriage at all, which I don't think holds water as a theory, because he was a king. He would be aware that it's not like he wants to give the throne to John. They are rivals as well. So he's aware that his duty is to have a son. But for whatever reason, that did not happen. And even when they reconcile in 1195, we're told that they do consummate the marriage. He knows her biblically in the matter of speaking. He's making some kind of effort, but for whatever reason, maybe he just gives up, or they don't get along, or she's infertile, or we don't know.
Right. And Richard did have a son, but
he
was illegitimate.
Yeah, he was illegitimate. He had one son, as far as we know, who's Philip of Cognac, and that's kind of the only son we know of for him, although multiple men in his family had quite a few illegitimate children. So sometimes they said, well, Richard only has one, he's not really, going around sowing his wild oats, so to speak. But we don't know, because again, that is, speculative.
Mm-hmm. So just speaking of speculativeness, he has this close friendship, but then rivalry with Philip II. And then he has a son who ends up being named Philip. That always struck me as a strange twist.
I think his son was born before that happened, but I'm not sure. So I think in around 1195-ish, he was 1196, sometime around that period of the first reconciliation with Berengaria, his son was, brought to court, and I think he was a teenager at the time. So I think he was a little bit older than that. And Philip is obviously a fairly common name.
Yeah, so, it also feels like between both France and England, there's only like 5 first names.
That is true. Philip, John, William, Richard, that will cover like most people.
Yeah.
So
a dozen different Matildas,
Yes. So I don't think that's related in terms of, I think his son was born before that whole fiasco happened.
So the general, like, if one were to assign something to Richard, it seems like there's lots of good evidence that he had at least homosexual tendencies, but it could have been bi. He also, though, has this really strong identity, like kind of what I consider the primary identity of Richard is as the Crusader king.
Yes.
And so what do we know about him in terms of religious fervor and his own kind of religious beliefs and zealotry?
I don't know if I would use the word zealotry necessarily, because Richard was actually known as one of the more pragmatic crusade leaders. Like, he was long-term willing to negotiate with Saladin. That was one of the things that Philip used against him when he was leaving early. He's like all this friendly chatter with the Muslims, Richard is treating them as diplomatic, as regular enemies. He's not treating them as friends, but he's treating them as regular enemies. You talk, you do diplomacy, you have battles, you talk again. He's not treating them like horrible infidel heretics in a way that we see sometimes in the earlier crusade polemics. Like at some point, he's willing to marry his sister Joanna to Saladin's brother. He has talking about all these diplomatic schemes that he has in mind. He and Saladin's brother actually end up becoming friends, which is kind of remarkable because they end up talking a lot during the negotiations. And, there is evidence that Richard treating the Muslims as regular enemies instead of, holy war enemies caused tension with the rest of the crusading contingent. So he does very much believe in the mission of the Crusades. He is, he has throughout his life, he's known to enjoy church ceremony a lot more than Henry does for matter. He enjoys that part, but he also doesn't quite act the same way that previous crusade leaders have done when it comes to interacting with Muslims. So he is chastised for that, and his own contingent is a little suspicious as to why he's talking to them or talking to the enemy. I think which is what I think Thomas Asbridge's article about the negotiations between Richard and Saladin on the Crusade calls it. It is surprising for the pattern of crusade rhetoric that we have mostly encountered so far.
Mm-hmm. So, like I said at the very beginning, my primary association with Richard I is growing up watching Robin Hood movies where he shows up at the end and he's a larger than life heroic figure.
Yes.
Was he, and I mentioned he's been treated this way historically at times, and there was this big kind of Victorian push to sort of emphasize him as heroic.
Yes.
Was he viewed as a heroic, manly figure during his lifetime and immediately afterwards?
He was, he was in some ways, because he did get the name, Coeur de Lion in his lifetime. So, he was known as this very brave warrior. He attracted a lot of glory, probably disproportionate to what he actually did, in terms of going on crusade, because the fall of Jerusalem had been such a shocking event in 1187. So Richard vowing to go on crusade fit with his established, heroic image as this brave warrior, this, defender of Christendom, whether he was or not. He benefited a lot from that publicity, and he benefited in sense from by being absent, because, when he's gone, it's easier to make this heroic image of him off in the Holy Land battling infidels. And when he is home, he isn't necessarily doing a whole lot. He's usually taxing them to, get money to fight Philip some more. So since his historical reputation very much benefits by the fact that he is absent, like John, for example, is a lot more interested in being King of England than Richard ever is. Like John takes a lot more interest in day-to-day politics, and of course he is not remembered fondly, to put it mildly. Have King John losing the crown of jewels. King John, is the terrible, awful king. He's, forced to sign Magna Carta. There's kind of this competing mythology about him, which is an opposite to Richard, even though John is obviously more interested in the job of being King of England than Richard ever was. So Richard viewed England mostly as a way to raise money for war, either for war in the Holy Land or against Philip. But because he is able to benefit from that crusading legacy, and because he's absent, and you can blame what's going wrong on, his regents or John or anybody else who's actually there, it's a lot easier to sort of treat him favorably, because he's this, he's often in the desert fighting for the glory of God. It's easy to mythologize that.
And so would it be fair to say that even though he is being rebuked by the church for his sexual misdeeds, and there is this notion during his lifetime that he might be a sodomite, that he might have these homosexual inclinations, that those rumors or those allegations, those don't interfere, those don't prevent him from having the reputation of being a manly warrior?
No, they don't, because he is still the king. He is the head of state. He is the leader of the crusade. He is, one of the most famous people in Western Europe. He has an immense amount of power. And even if he's being occasionally chided by the church or, rebuked for his private habits, that does not separate him from that power. He is still able to use that power whenever he chooses and in whatever way he chooses. And because I think there's often this tendency to conflate queerness with marginalization or oppression, or being sidelined in some way. And that's not necessarily the case in the medieval world, and especially not with Richard. He is very powerful, and he remains very powerful. Like that rebuke, even if the church is just saying, hey, your majesty, please think about having a son, they are still treating him as the king. He is not ever marginalized because of whatever he might be alleged to do on the side. He is still very much, the central figure in this power dynamic.
Right. And in those film adaptations, especially the Robin Hood ones, there's often these very homosocial bonds that he has with Robin, where they're very close, sometimes other crusaders as well, sometimes Ivanhoe. And he often has this role where I kind of think of him as the noble wingman. There's like a dozen movies that end with Richard somehow being involved with Robin and Marion getting married at the end. He's giving them permission. He is pushing them forward in some way. He's getting these kids together so they can lead their heteronormative lifestyles. And he's very encouraging of this. And it's presented in a way that is very, very heteronormative, very broy. Like he's got, these associations, the Men in Tights parody movie, the Patrick Stewart version of King Richard has a long, passionate kiss with Marion because he's so, so manly. And then in contrast, what we get in a lot of these same movies are very effeminate versions of John. John is often queer-coded in these films. And he is presented as effete. He's presented in ways that read to modern audiences as this is a homosexual man. He's sometimes limp-wristed. He speaks with an affectation. He'll wear gaudy clothes. And this is clearly meant to contrast him to his more manly brother. And this is a thing that we've pointed out in a lot of our film reviews, and mostly in terms of it being a problematic thing. Not that it is, again, a problem that anybody would be gay, but a problem that we're queer coding the villain of the movie,
Yes.
And
especially when it's kind of a displacement from Richard, where that could more accurately be applied. But because he is the manly, heroic central figure, we can't have that associated with queerness. So it's kind of displaced onto John because we already know John's bad and, he's the villain, he's scheming, et cetera, et cetera. So it sort of reinforces that message, in terms of this displaced queerness, which can't be put on Richard because he's a hero. So you have to put it on John instead, even if that's obviously directly opposite to what it seems like it was.
Yeah, and there was no evidence in particular relating to John having homosexual inclinations.
No, he was also another one of the very heterosexual members of the family because he had a lot of, illegitimate children. We know many of his mistresses, in terms of he was more like his father, Henry, than like Richard.
And that's the sort of thing that has fed into some of the 1970s and 1960s, very Freudian psychology that is centered around John and Richard, something that you see very much in play in the Lion and Winter movie, where John is Henry's favorite and Richard has this attachment with Eleanor and he's her favorite. And that's also one of the first times that there's really any kind of pop culture presentation of Richard's queerness is also in that film. Yeah, no, I think that displaced queerness because of, a long homophobic history in our filmmaking, really. is to answer for what we have seen in our movies for the past 100 years.
Certainly, yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of that, and because it's a lot of uncomfortable about ever putting it on Richard directly for varying reasons. So it's not, it's it's moved somewhere else to a more socially acceptable target.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's a little bit gets to the crux of one of the things that I always want to hit on and that I think is valuable when we're considering these figures from the past, whether it's through an adaptation of a story or whether it's when we're considering the real people who were alive centuries ago, is trying to step away from our modern lenses and our modern framing. And the baggage that we have over the past, several decades of gender politics didn't exist in the same way during the lifetime of these individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, where Bill Bergwinkle, who's one of the great scholars on medieval French queerness, puts it well when he says that whenever we talk about homosexuality in the Middle Ages, we're expected to caveat it and asterisk it and, apologize for using the term at all, basically, because it wasn't technically invented then. But we also use heterosexuality as our guiding standard, well before that term was invented either. In the in the late 19th century, the German sexologists become, developing classifications of homosexual, heterosexual, in the words and the terms, but we're expected to accept heterosexuality even when we don't, even when we are supposed to not accept homosexuality. We're looking at the pre-modern period, we just assume heterosexuality exists, but then we have to caveat and carve out homosexuality, and it's not a fair standard. So, even if we're looking at behavior that we might say, yeah, that seems queer to me, you still are expected to kind of caveat it as much as you can, and to sort of leave a space for it not actually to be the interpretation, which I don't necessarily agree with as terms of somebody who's working on, more queer history, more medieval queer history at the moment. There is a lot of, it's like, oh, we don't really mean this. We can find another explanation. It's like, well, no, that looks like the explanation. So sometimes you have to, call a spade, or call, you say this is queer and this is not treated in the same way as it is now. No, but that doesn't disidentify it. What we're saying, is present here, because a lot of these anxieties, that we're having right now, as you say, around gender politics, around, transgender panics, around, the public existence of queer people, you can find a lot of resonances for that in the 12th century, as we were talking about earlier with, Peter the Chanter and the other churchmen who are becoming both more aware of a queer subculture and more determined to repress it. So the fact that they're writing so much about it means that it is being lived in some real sense,
they have to be responding to something.
Yeah, they're responding to something that they're seeing. So it does not mean it doesn't exist. It means quite the opposite. So, when you're saying, and when you're looking at history in terms of, how can I understand history? How can I understand what's going on now? There's certainly, I would say, especially in the 12th century and the 14th century, there are particular queer anxieties that I think are very relevant, especially from the 14th century, to what we're experiencing now in terms of social upheaval, in terms of, famine, climate change, political upheaval, war. All these things are going, plague are all happening in the 14th century. And they do involve, questions of queerness, questions of personal morality, questions of how to behave, how to be a right kind of man or woman. These things are not separate and they're not unidentifiable, even if they appear before we have the terms for them.
Right. Is there anything you can tell us about what you're working on now in this field?
I have a couple publications upcoming. I wrote a chapter about the 14th century figure John Eleanor Reichner, who's sometimes viewed as a proto-transgender figure in medieval London. That's coming up. I don't know exactly when it's going to be published. It's in the review process at the moment. I also just finished a book chapter on the 12th century werewolf, Old French romance Bisclavret.
I love that one. Yeah.
By Marie de France.
Yeah,
and
that's such a great story.
That is coming in an edited collection, I think probably sometime next year. So there are a couple of publications which I have worked on. I've read a couple book reviews for medieval queer studies, so I do try to keep up in terms of what I'm working on in my publication schedule. So,
all right, fantastic. So thank you so much for spending some time today, spending a chunk of your morning, letting us know a little bit more of the background, a little more details about Richard and queerness in general and how we're approaching it with our modern lens today, because we do use Robin Hood as kind of our launching point for these conversations. Do you have any versions of Robin Hood, any adaptations that you have a special fondness or familiarity with?
I have done less on the Robin Hood side, although I have one friend who would be all over this question because she loves Robin Hood. She's writing a paper, I think, on Robin Hood and disability right now. And in terms of visual representations of Robin Hood, I think she's probably seen all of them. So she would have a lot of feelings about this, but I have done a less Robin Hood in this context. He's kind of come up, tangentially in terms of his connection to Richard or his legendary status. So because I'm a historian, I have worked more with the historical than the literary sources. So I've had a little less to do with Robin Hood, but I think he is interesting in that he, if we have any evidence for his existence at all, it would probably be in the, mid 13th century, which is well after Richard. But he kind of slotted into that space where Richard is on crusade, where there's, this mythology of a kingless England, even though that fits, in other points in history. I think it's interesting that he has become attached to this particular realm and this particular time frame in terms of, the other questions that we can ask of, why is Robin Hood here? Why is Robin Hood popular? What is he saying about, obviously as a story about the time that he is placed in.
Right. And one of the things that's very interesting about kind of Robin Hood fandom now is how he is used as a lens for looking at marginalized groups, which of course includes queer people, and how often there are modern adaptations of Robin Hood that are queer stories in some way. And sometimes Robin is a gay man, sometimes Robin's a gay woman. There's lots of different permutations around it.
I think just as an interesting tidbit, which is something that came up in my last book chapter, is your podcast is called Into the Greenwood, and the forest is a very queer space in old French literary tradition. When you go into the wood, when you go into the forest, you are in some sense leaving the strictures of patriarchal heterosexuality behind. You are opening up a possibility to exist in a different kind of way. It's also the 13th century, the roman de silence, where the heroine who is born a girl is raised as a boy, and that's in this something that's kind of discovered in the space where they go into the forest, they go into this place away from civilized society rule. So when they are in the woods, they are able to exist in a different kind of life. And I think that's probably why there's a certain amount of resonance for Robin as a queer figure, because this is, this established connection where the woods are where you can be free of that.
Yeah, very, very much. And it's one of the things that has been making me really happy to see, just in terms of being a fan of Robin Hood and seeing it have this sort of modern applicability, that it's there for people to use and find solace in and create new stories with in that way.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks. That was a really interesting conversation. So yeah, I'm glad we can make it happen.
My thanks again to Hilary Rhodes for that fascinating conversation. Make sure to check the episode description for a link to their paper, Richard the Lionheart, Contested Queerness and Crusading Memory, published by the Open Library of Humanities Journal. And thank you also to our generous supporters on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, who provide the funds necessary to keep this podcast going. You can join those wonderful and devilishly attractive supporters by going to patreon.com/intogreenwood. Backers are the first to know when new episodes are out, and if you support us at the Merry Bandit or Notorious Outlaw level, you unlock all sorts of bonus audio content. If you'd like to show a little support, but aren't sure about committing to a recurring donation, then you can also leave a tip on buymeacoffee.com/intogreenwood. We've only had a single supporter on that website, but their contribution has been immeasurable. Getting the affirmation that people are listening and appreciating the show really does help keep us going. And that's something you can also do simply by leaving positive ratings and reviews wherever you listen to podcasts. It's a quick, simple, and completely free action that will do a lot to help this show be found by others. As always, a minimum of 10% of all proceeds we do manage to raise will always go to charitable causes. At the time of recording, that charity is still Trees, Water, and People, a top-rated organization bringing sustainable food and clean water to impoverished communities around the world. If you'd like to get in touch or see the various bits and bobs that occasionally get posted, you can find us on social media. We're on Blue Sky, Threads, Facebook, and Instagram, all with the handle @IntoGreenwood. We used to be on the website that used to be known as Twitter, but for reasons that should be obvious, we have left that particular platform. Additionally, there is an active Discord server for all things Robin Hood related, run by friend of the show, Mike Nichols. If you'd like to join that Discord community where we source questions, organize watch parties, play games, have a book club, and just generally engage in friendly discussion, then reach out over email or social media to get an invitation. Into the Greenwood is produced and edited by me, Thaddeus Papke. Our theme music is by Plastic 3. That's all for now, though. So once more, I find myself wishing you safe travels until our next journey together into the Greenwood.